Welcome back, everybody. As you can see from the opening slide, today we are going to discuss the Great Depression, or how did the United States go from record-setting historical economic boom from the 1920s to a catastrophic decline in the economic growth, which plunged millions of Americans into poverty, unemployment, and despair. And this depression would last from 1929 and gradually get worse and end sometime around 1941-42, coinciding with the beginning of this country's involvement in World War One. Now you understand what a depression is, and a depression is not necessarily feeling sad or melancholy, which I'm sure many people did feel. Okay, so technically what's the definition of a depression? You take GDP, which is the measure of an economy's size. Mind you, mind you, that metric was not used in the 1920s or in the 1930s. In fact, that metric came into existence thanks to the economic advisors that FDR brought on board when he became president. So they were counting backwards. But we had many of these measures that I'm going to cite to you, many of these metrics that we use, these macroeconomic metrics to measure economic performance, simply didn't exist during the 1920s, but would exist soon after that because of the Depression. Economists reached a conclusion, it makes sense, that we need to have data, we need to have numbers in certain areas of the economy and how it's performing to get a good idea of the big picture. The same way that a doctor needs to have everything from heart rate to blood pressure to white blood cell count, a million different things to give an overall holistic idea picture, get a overall idea of the patient. Well, economists need that too. Okay, so what does depression mean? If the economy starts to experience a drop in growth, that means the economy, instead of expanding, is actually contracting. Okay? This contraction of economic growth, which is always tied to productivity declines. Well, I shouldn't say always, because there's been exceptions after the fact, but productivity declines, economic activity declines, economic growth declines. These numbers are given to the Bureau of Economic Statistics every quarter. Okay, companies tend to do things they crunch their numbers on a quarterly basis. If it goes on, you know, for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and it's measurable, they call this a recession. If this economic contraction, with everything that comes along with an economic contraction, high unemployment rates, uh, lasts for more than 6 months, then it could be called a depression. Okay? And if the numbers are severe enough, it could be called a depression. A depression is a very severe and sustained economic recession. Now, you guys were little, but you did live through the Great Recession. Um, so just imagine a Great Depression would be severe and of longer duration than a Great Recession. So before we go into what happened in the 1930s, let's go back to the 1920s. Let's discuss what the economic picture was in the 1920s. We talked about this some time ago. What were the contributing factors to the economic boom in the 1920s? Absolutely our involvement in World War One and the money that's going to start flowing in from Europe to repay loans that were taken out during the war is going to put a lot of money in the hands of American banks, and American banks are going to reciprocate by putting a lot of money in the hands of American businesses and American consumers at very low interest rates. So an easy money policy drove a lot of that economic growth. It wasn't, the economy grew by 42% between 1920 and 1929. One of the reasons was the availability of dollars in very large quantities at very low interest rates. Also, innovations in manufacturing itself. For instance, mass production. We look at Henry Ford and the assembly line. Mass production increased not only the output of manufacturing firms, but also allowed them to manufacture greater units in less time, therefore significant increases in efficiency. Of course, this performance of American companies, for the most part manufacturing, which was the keystone of the American economy at the time, would be reflected in the stock market. Because after all, what's bought and sold in the stock market? Stocks. What are stocks? Pieces of ownership in a company. If a company is doing well, then by extension, that piece of ownership is going to appreciate in value. The stock market began to grew on an average of 20% per year. Much of this was speculation. Much of this was speculative, driving up the market value of your average stock far beyond what it was really worth. But the fact of the matter is the stock market, driven almost exclusively by investor speculation, grew by on an average of 20% per year. Low interest rates that never went above 5% fueled investments, fueled capital expenditures and expansion, fueled new business construction, and more importantly, fueled consumer purchases. Jobs were plenty. The unemployment rate rarely, if ever, went above 4%. The interest rate rarely went above 5%. Okay. And, we should talk about the Red Scare and the harm that it did to unions. It dropped union membership in 1921 from 19% to about 12% by the time we get to the latter 20s. Okay. And so no wonder, and there was a realignment after World War One. The American voters shifted from sympathizing with the progressive program and the bitter taste left behind by Woodrow Wilson and the fear-mongering of the Red Scare. Millions of these voters that otherwise would have been progressive voters at the turn of the century became pro-Republican conservative voters, very much believing in the idea, the belief that whatever's good, just like Calvin Coolidge said, whatever's good for business, whatever benefits business, ultimately benefits all Americans, because ultimately it all trickles down to everyone. Okay, and we've gone here back and forth. We've brought that one out, dusted it off, put it before a new generation, and it tends to have a lot of traction with some folks. So that is what happened in the 1920s. But much of that boom, we cannot forget. The boom, the stock market, that's investor speculation. Investor speculation in itself was fueled by the availability of low interest money. Okay? So also let's talk about some of the myths of the 1920s. Okay? This utopia had cracks in it, plenty. Number one, it was for most part, this castle was built on sand. It was built on borrowed money. And here's the thing about borrowed money. Eventually you have to do what? You have to pay it back. Okay? Yes, easy money drove consumer purchases, quite often far beyond what workers were actually earning in wages that grew quite modestly throughout the 1920s. By 1921, consumer debt's about $3 billion. By 1929, it more than doubled to $7 billion. Okay? Keep in mind, the economy in 1929 at its peak is $103 billion. We didn't have a multi-trillion dollar economy yet. The pie isn't that big. So $7 billion in consumers. We haven't regained that amount of consumer debt as a percentage of the total economy until recently. The top tax rate dropped from 73% to 24%. So, they started undermining, what was it, the 16th Amendment quite quickly. Well, the idea was if we drop taxes, that'll create even more successful people, and you'll have even more successful people paying taxes, and therefore expand the tax base itself. And that's not purely untrue. More myths about the 1920s and this great boom. Yes, it's true, but 40% of Americans lived in poverty. For the most part, minorities and rural Americans. Half of American farmers were in debt. They borrowed like crazy during World War I to sell food to Europe, in which they were making a lot of money on. When Europe stopped buying American food products because of the Ford McCumber tariff, um, they were left with excess food, couldn't sell it, couldn't pay off their mortgages, um, and you have a ton of farm foreclosures. By 1920, 4 out of every 1,000 farms would be foreclosed by the banks. By 1927, that's 18 out of every 1,000 farms. Incredible inequality. By the end of the decade, 1% of the highest earners in this country earned 24% of the nation's income. And that's when 1 out of every $4 was earned by 1% of the population. And 40% of the population lived in poverty. So there's a lot of truths to the 1920s, but there's a lot of myths to the 1920s. We tend to ignore the fact that despite the expansion of that pie, it was not sliced in any equitable way. 40% of the population lived in poverty. Farmers were in a state of crisis. Consumer debt skyrocketed, more than doubled. Um, and so it was not, this great utopia was not, flawless as, sometimes it's been portrayed to be. And so here comes 1929. And much of the economy is being driven by speculation. There's a lot of similarities with the housing bubble, right? Investors are, here's the thing: investors are buying. Well, let's go to the next slide. Here we go. Let's start here. The prosperity and easy credit of the 1920s would lead to an economic depression by the end of the decade. Many borrowed money and bought stock with that money, hoping to get rich on the stock market. But let's stop there, because for years I used to teach it this way. And we have a tendency of doing this, of passing off the blame to individual Americans. Okay? Well, the reason why this happened is because individual Americans, you know, didn't know how to manage their finances correctly, bit off more than they could chew. No, it wasn't. That's an absolute lie. The villains of this story are the same villains of 2008. Okay? Yes, there was a lot of borrowing on credit. They call this buying on margin. All you had to do was put 10%, 20% down, and people were borrowing money to buy stocks. And why wouldn't you? If the chances of appreciating greatly were there, well, of course the bank will lend you money. The stock market's doing great. It'll probably appreciate. You'll cash out. They'll get their money back, and you'll make some money in the long run. Okay? But the fact of the matter is, only 10% of households actually had any money in the stock market. So if that's true, how could you really blame average ordinary Americans for this? Simple, because it was not the fault of average everyday Americans doing this. Who are the villains in the story? The banks. 90% of the money invested in the stock market was put there by financial institutions like banks, who without their depositors' knowledge was using depositor money, quite often life savings, to gamble on the stock market. 90% of the time, it was banks that were buying millions of dollars of stock on the stock market and gambling with that money. So let's put blame where blame needs to be. Okay? It was not in the 10% of households that put money in the stock market. It was in those financial institutions that were responsible for more than 90% of the money that was flowing into the stock market. And of course, when we talk about the stock market, and we'll have some clarification, what exactly? Well, it's a market where they sell stocks. What's exactly a stock, sir? A stock is a piece of ownership in a company. You can make money off of it one or two ways. You could either hold on to it, and therefore, as partial owner, that's exactly what you are. When you own a stock, you are a partial owner. And as partial owner, you have a right to a percentage of the distributed profits on a quarterly basis. These distributed profits are referred to as dividends. The company pays shareholders dividends as per the number of shares that they own in that company. They have a right to. They are partial owners. Or you can make money selling that stock to others investors that will be willing to buy that stock from you. And if it is a stock that performs well, okay, its market value will reflect that performance and you'll be able to sell it for more than what you bought it for. There's a risk involved. If a company does not turn a profit, your dividends shrink or you receive no dividends. If a company does not turn a profit, its market value will drop, perhaps even below what you bought it for. That's what they do in the stock market. They sell pieces of ownership in companies. And I'm simplifying for this as much as I can. Stocks sometimes also go by the umbrella term securities. And if we're discussing securities, we also have to discuss bonds. Bonds are IOUs. Banks attract capital from investors either by selling portions of ownership, this is called stocks, or by borrowing money from individual investors, these are called bonds. Okay? The picture you see there is Wall Street. Wall Street is the home of one of the oldest stock markets in the country, if not the oldest, the New York Stock Exchange. So what you're seeing there is a big crowd lined up in front of Wall Street. That's in Lower Manhattan. It was given that name because once upon a time the city wall was right across the street. And inside that building you have the New York Stock Exchange, in which you have brokers that function as middlemen for the investment firms they work for. And they buy and sell, okay, as per the demands of the investors that have money in that investment firm and whether they want to buy this or sell that, et cetera, et cetera. Most of this today is done by computers anyway. And here's an example of what you buy on the stock market. Stocks. I don't even know if physical stocks exist anymore, but that's what a stock is. It makes you partial owner in a company because you own partial ownership in a company, okay? And by that, you have a right to a piece of the profit, which they call dividends. And of course, you know, if interest rates are low, and not just people, but well, that's that you know, and companies are borrowing, and they're borrowing to expand. Um, and it's not just that they're expanding because consumers are borrowing and they're spending more, and there's more, you know, consumer demand drives companies to increase their supply. So a lot of this is being driven by this, and of course, you know, if the company turns a profit, it's reflected in the market value of the stock, and the stock goes up, and the stock goes up, investor demand for that stock goes up as well, as does the value of the stock itself. So we're kind of running in circles here, so I think you get the picture. And as you can see here, um, so the stock market grew 20% a year throughout the 1920s. If we look at the New York Stock Exchange index, which is an average, you know, I don't know how many it is. If there's 500 companies that sell stock on the New York Stock Exchange, you know, some go up, some go down on a daily basis. If they were to calculate some yearly average, you know, that's where you get these points on the indexes. We're talking about, yeah, I mean, overall, the value of the market itself going up, you know, quadrupling. You know, here between 1926 and 1930 alone. Okay. All right, so Mr. Hernandez, what happened? So this is what I always explain to students. Imagine an auction, right? Auctions are places where, you know, it's a market, you know, something is being sold of limited supply, and there's a certain demand for it. And there are buyers that show up in an auction, buyers that have access to money. And buyers, potential buyers, will compete with one another, okay, to obtain whatever is being sold on that auction. And they will compete with one another by offering to pay more and more. Well, if whatever is being sold is of great demand, and why would it be of great demand? Because there's a very good chance that it might be worth more tomorrow than it is today. Well, that's going to do a lot to fuel consumer demand. and drive up the offering price for this. As long as there's money and as long as there's buyers, the sky is the limit. And this happened to stocks during the 1920s, like it happened to houses in the early 2000s. As long as there's money, there's buyers. And as long as there's buyers with money, the sky's the limit. But at some point, there is a limit. Okay? At some point, those that lend the money are going to start to get nervous. Hey, you're asking for more and more and more. And at the end of the day, how realistic is it that you will ultimately be able to pay for this? So little by little, the lenders, as the price tag goes up, the lenders are going to get more and more nervous about the total amount they end up lending. And then eventually it's going to become an issue as, wait a minute, let's look at your income. Let's look at your income to debt ratio. Have we exceeded the realm of the realistic? And once it seems that we have exceeded the realm of the realistic, and of course, there's people that have more equity because of the assets they own. They could negotiate for greater and greater amounts that they will be able to borrow from lenders. But at some point, when the price gets to a certain point, I feel uncomfortable about lending you that much. Sure, there's a possibility of it appreciating, but how much more? And there's the question of, will you be able to pay? Even if we were to liquidate all your assets, would you be able to pay off a debt if it came to that? And that's when a certain chill enters the room. And eventually this chill is going to reach, whatever's being sold. And eventually the willingness to offer more and more and more will slowly become more tempered until the bubble pops. That's exactly what they mean when the bubble pops. Okay? The market has reached a limit, or aggregate demand has reached a limit as per how much they're really willing to offer for this. How much is this really worth? Realistically, how much more could this appreciate? Realistically, do you have the income, even if we were to liquidate all your assets, to pay off a debt of this size? And if all those questions start to be taken very seriously, then less buyers, less offers, the price no longer starts to climb, and then at some point, nobody's willing to offer more. The bubble popped. Now, everything starts to travel in reverse. Well, if we could only get this much today, then who's to say if we'll be able to get even less tomorrow? Well, I don't want that. I don't want to end up having to sell, on top that I already owe money, I don't want to end up having to sell what I have for even less than what I bought it for. Let me cut my losses now. And what was once a bull market starts to grow bearish. Now everybody wants to sell what they have for fear that they'll be left holding a bag, owning a bunch of assets that little by little are not going to be worth what they paid for them. That's how the stock market crashed in October 1929. Stock prices began to fall rather than climb. And this is very psychological. There's a lot of psychology in economics, and people start to panic. Just look at how coronavirus has affected the economy, not based on anything actually happening yet, but fear of the future. Fear of the future is what caused investors en masse to sell their stock. Well, if that dude's selling his stock, I'm going to sell my stock. And if I want to sell my stock before that guy, you know what? I'll take even less for it. And another guy's going to do the same, and another guy's going to do the same. And everybody's desperation to get rid of the stock they have as soon as possible before it devaluates anymore drives values further down and faster. Panic investors start to sell their shares, causing a massive market crash. Do not forget, 90% of the investors were not individuals. They were financial institutions, banks. So when banks start to experience a depreciation in the assets that that firm owns, and that firm happens to be a bank, think about how that affects, okay, how much money they have at their disposal to even bank to begin with, to even function as a bank when their assets are beginning to disappear, evaporate by the day. The first catastrophic drop is going to be in October of 1929, and it's not going to slow down until 1932. From almost 400-point high, it's going to drop to a 40-point low in 1932. In other words, okay, the stock market went from a total $64 billion in 1929, and in 2 months, by 1930, it's going to be worth $30 billion. The total value of the stock market was cut by half in 2 months alone. October, November, October and November, well, those last 2 months of 1929. So how does this affect the rest of the market? The first ones they're going to get hit are the banks. Because after all, it was mostly their money in the stock market. Okay? Banks lose assets, banks can't bank. Banks can't bank, they certainly can't. If they can't honor the money that depositors put in their firm, okay, because they are hemorrhaging money, okay, they're certainly in no position to lend money, which is what banks are supposed to do primarily. People hearing about the stock market crash run to their banks. Give me my money. That's my money. Give me my money back before this bank has. That's called a bank run. It was nothing new. A bank run is when a bank runs out of money, that it could no longer function as a bank. And why were the banks running out of money? Because they were losing it, because the assets they owned in the market were evaporating. The lower and lower stocks were being, the lower and lower the prices that the stocks were being sold for. If a bunch of banks experience bank runs, it's called a bank panic. And there's people alive today that experienced a similar one in 2008. Okay? When a bank panic takes hold, um, people run to the bank, they ask for their money. Eventually, the bank has no cash. The bank has no cash, it has to close its doors. Millions of people lost their life savings. And the only thing they did wrong was trust that financial institution and put their money in that bank. And they did not know that their bank was gambling with their life savings on the stock market. Millions were ruined because of this. Ordinary average, notice my particular perspective is here. I don't really care about the 1% of what happens to them. Some say they jumped out of windows when they lost their fortunes. That's a myth. Okay? What we should, focus on is how this hurt millions of ordinary, hardworking Americans through no fault of their own. Okay? Yeah, maybe they indebted themselves. But if wages had been higher, that would not have been necessary. But why were wages not higher? Because companies prefer to reward shareholders, okay, rather than their employees. Because when you tell potential shareholders that they stand to collect even larger and larger paydays on their dividends, that's going to attract even more shareholders and bring in more money to that company to be able to expand and even pay more to your top people. And that's a problem we've had recently too. Okay? When companies make profits, more often than not, They prefer to divert those profits to shareholders than their employees. And here's a picture of people lining up trying to take out their money, and millions of banks had to close because they ran out of money. And then the ripple effect begins. Then businesses are no longer going to attract the capital they used to be able to, okay, because nobody's buying stocks anymore. And whatever stocks are out there that reflect that particular business, okay, have absolutely lost their value, not even worth the paper they're printed on. And you can't even turn to the banks to borrow money from them to stay afloat because the banks aren't lending out money because a lot of them just don't exist anymore. The market crash led to hundreds of bank failures. That led to a credit crunch. Okay, credit crunch is when the availability and willingness to lend money is no longer there because frankly it doesn't exist in the amounts it used to before. And that drove many businesses into bankruptcy. What do they do to salvage the business? They start to cut costs. What do they do to cut costs? They let people go and they cut hours and they cut productivity. And see if they cut to the bone just enough, whether they could still stay afloat as a business. That's going to mean people are going to be let go. But here's the irony. You are letting people go. And yet, at the same time, you're hoping to just do enough business to stay around. But the more people you let go, you're also letting go of potential consumers. And if people aren't working, they aren't making money. If they're not making money, they're not buying stuff, and they're not buying stuff from you. And if you notice a shortage of demand, your business is going to start to suffer as well. It's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle. I mean, we end up with 25% unemployment. Newsflash, and well, I'm recording this video in the middle of months into the pandemic. Apparently, we beat those numbers. Apparently, unemployment rates are higher than 25% right now. So that kind of gives us some perspective. This was not a light switch. We did not go from prosperity to poverty overnight. This was slow and gradual, like cancer, not a heart attack. Okay? Little by little, it ate away at the fabric of the economy. Okay? This is a very slow, transitional dive downwards. Lost incomes and falling wages caused businesses and farms to experience a decline in the demand for their goods. And the farms were already in trouble in the 1920s. Now, even all the more so. As sales fell, so did prices. Producers all over the country had to drive down prices. And so that seems like, well, that's good news. Deflation. Prices dropped everywhere. Everything became more affordable. Yes, but 25% of the population didn't have a job. And a significant portion of the population that did have a job took serious pay cuts and cuts in hours. So everybody is earning a lot less, if no money at all. And if that's the case, the only reason why prices are going down is out of desperation. And nobody's buying anything, even with low prices. Okay, it's not that they can't afford it. They don't have any money to spend to begin with. And whatever money they have, they're going to spend it on essentials. Food, for example. Most businesses never recovered. So here's some pretty graphs to look at. The Great Depression in the United States. 1929, well, let's look at the top one. Stock values per share. On average, what are we looking at here? Everything from 1932, 1928, 29, 1930. Okay. Oh, of different companies. Radio, American Telegraph, U.S. Steel, Goldman Sachs, American, I don't know what America can means. But I think we could pick up a pattern that they peaked in September of 29, and then it was just a long ride down. This graph ends here. And as far as all the value of look at that green one, radio. I don't know if that's the radio industry as a whole or a particular company. Peaked at 400, over $450 a share to near zero by 1932. Bank failures, 1929, 659 banks failed. By 1933, 5,190 banks failed. And unemployment peaked in 1933 at 25%. Understand this is an average. Some industries experienced greater than others. Some regions of the country experienced greater than others. African Americans always double the number. Double the number of unemployment. Okay? Many of the unemployed became homeless. People lost their homes. Would you believe that? I don't have a job. I can't pay my mortgage. I can't pay my mortgage. The bank is going to kick me out of the house. Okay? And we prefer to have an empty house. Okay? We had this in 2008. We had 7 empty houses for every unemployed homeless person in this country. Prefer to have an empty house. Okay. And to have somebody living in it that doesn't have a job because they can't pay the mortgage. Some men abandoned their families. Some men, well, here's something that happened in the 1930s. Hobo culture was born. So I hope you know the difference between a bum, a tramp, and a hobo. And I can tell you something about hobos right now. Hobos are not lazy. Hobos are not, freeloaders. The actual definition of a hobo, these are men that want to work. And they would travel the country by riding the rails. What does that mean? They would jump on trains going here and there, get off at some town, wherever, hoping to find work so they could send money back home. Okay? And many towns were very hostile about this and would kick out strangers because they only had so many jobs in town. That's what hobos were, and they developed a whole culture and, special symbols about, this town is friendly, this town's not. You can get food here and there. But hobos were men that were traveling, usually riding the rails or hitchhiking or walking, looking for work elsewhere because there was no work at home. And those are the ones that were still sending money back home. Some men outright abandoned their families. Some families had to divide their children among family members of an extended family because they simply could not afford to maintain all their children at home. So these were very tough times for people. Here's a picture of a shanty town, but in the 1930s, people came to started calling them Hoovervilles because let's blame President Herbert Hoover. Well, if you're president, that's what happens. You're going to become a magnet for everything that goes wrong, whether it's actually in the sphere of the possible of you being even able to fix it or not. Hoovervilles, and in public lands and parks, this became more and more common as people lost their homes. And millions turned to charities. Whatever um, resources, charitable organizations, usually religious ones, remember the social gospel, the progressive era, could pull together soup kitchens for millions of hungry Americans. Caloric intake declined to the point that the average height and weight of the American, particularly children, dropped. People who reached childhood in the 1940s, in the late 30s and 40s, actually weighed less and were shorter than children a generation earlier. That's called childhood malnutrition. That's happened 3 times in this country's history. After the Depression, during Reconstruction, and after the American Revolution. The children that grew up during those events were substantially shorter and weighed less than the children of the generation before. and a lot of other interesting parallels. When there's no money, when people aren't working, here's the other thing. When people, when you have 25% of the people not working, that's 25% of the labor force that's not paying taxes. That means the tax base, the money that the government has at its disposal to even function as a government, begins to substantially shrink. And they have to figure out other ways. And it's very interesting. When do you think the movement to legalize marijuana really took off? In 2008. Those first states, the Californias and the Colorados, now all of a sudden started to look at legalizing marijuana as a way to make up for tax shortfalls. And we've seen this before in history. When do you think the movement to get rid of prohibition picked up? In 1933. This is ridiculous. Everything that the teetotalers claimed that getting rid of alcohol would accomplish was a lie. It was not true. It actually made things worse. Okay? What are we doing? Let's let adults make adult decisions of whether they want to buy booze or not, and we tax it and we regulate it, and that'll put some more money in government's pockets so the government could actually function. Very interesting parallels. That wouldn't you know it, the movement to repeal the 18th Amendment took off right during the Depression. Okay? To hopefully get some money in the public coffers so they could offer some kind of aid to the millions of people with that money. And if the economic situation wasn't bad enough, Mother Nature decided to add a little extra. Those American farmers, particularly in those states that you see highlighted on that map, in order to meet the demand for food during World War I, we're just going to say overdid it. Were irresponsible in their farming practices, end up depleting the topsoil. Because as long as there was money being made selling food to Europe during the war, they tried to sell as much as possible. Many were irresponsible. They end up ruining the topsoil. What happens? A particularly active year in that part of the country, which is known as the Dust Bowl. That's a very tornado-rich part of the country. What happens? It picks up all that depleted topsoil, and you end up with a catastrophic natural situation in the middle of the Depression. So the hazards of living in the Dust Bowl forced thousands of Midwestern farmers off their lands, not because of foreclosure, but because Mother Nature actually ruined their farms. Well, they ruined it first. And that's where you start to see a significant migration of people from Oklahoma and Kansas that basically were ruined during the Depression. They had some blame in it, starting to make their way towards California. These are the infamous Okies, and they weren't necessarily absolutely welcome in California because there were shortages of jobs, but California begins to experience this influx. This is where you get to show the Beverly Hillbillies. You're too young, you don't have no idea, but that's what it was. These very rural, not very educated Americans coming from that whole Texahoma region, making their way for California. Long story short, poverty, hunger, and illness became commonplace in American society. The world's wealthiest country in the world became poor. And it was a worldwide phenomenon. Because if American banks aren't lending to American businesses and American consumers, guess who they're definitely not lending to? Anybody else, anywhere else. Some countries withstood the storm better than others. Namely, if your economy was resource-based, and particularly your economy was based on producing and exporting a resource of which there was still a demand for, you did well. Cuba did well because Cuba's chief export was agriculture, agricultural goods. And when push comes to shove, when there's no money around, guess what you're going to spend the last pennies you have left? On food. The Soviet Union actually one of the few countries in this world that actually experienced economic growth throughout the 1930s. But that was because of 5-year plans and forced collectivization. That's another story. We could talk about it later. Um, for the most part, it was very engineered. How the Soviets actually experienced like substantial, like 3, 4, 5% a year economic growth during the 1930s. Um, but not the capitalist world, not Western Europe or the United States. It was a worldwide phenomenon, and I want you to keep in mind it's going to leave in its wake a, a lot of doubt, a lot of dissatisfaction as to the future of a capitalist economy. And we're going to see this in the ideological struggle that Europe goes through starting in the 1930s, much of it rooted in a significant number of Europeans simply not looking at capitalism the way they used to. This is also going to help the Soviets. Because now the Soviets have 10 years worth to point back on and actually criticize a market economy as a viable and sustainable economy for the future, especially when they were actually experiencing growth during those years. So here's another pretty little graphic about the Dust Bowl. Wheat prices. The price of wheat um, went up prior to 1929, and a lot of this was World War I, forcing farmers to cultivate billions of new acres, but in a very irresponsible way, and therefore they ruined their topsoil. And as you can see, this line graph, um, 1920 was actually a peak year in wheat harvested. 1930s in the plains, total area damaged by wind erosion. But I would say, first came topsoil erosion and then wheat erosion, wind erosion. 10 million, that's the number of acres in the southern plains that lost 5 inches of topsoil. 480 tons average loss of topsoil per acre. And so this graph doesn't tell you that's actually the fault of irresponsible farming practices. A profit-driven agricultural sector driven to produce more and more and more and more because, the market prices were there once upon a time. And dust storms peaked around 36, 37, 38. And this is always a very windy part of the country. So here's more pictures of the Dust Bowl. And this is a series of famous photographs that have become iconic now. Of just like they did during the Progressive era, how the other half lives. And those pictures did a lot to fuel much of the progressive reforms aimed at alleviating poverty. They went ahead and did it in the 1930s as well. Um, these photographs of Americans living in conditions that you would not expect in this country, in a poverty that you would not expect in this country, and that was very rattling, very shocking to a lot of people. And some may say these photos, just like it happened a generation earlier, contributed a lot to the New Deal reforms. They're going to come later. This is a side, I learned this at the Museum of American History in DC, and I just wanted to mention it before, I forget. There's a famous highway that starts in Chicago and goes all the way to Los Angeles. It's called Route 66. Many of the folks leaving Texas, Oklahoma, and that area took Route 66 to go to California. So that's a historical significance. They traveled along Route 66 to leave their abandoned, ruined farms and try to make a new life in California. Well, I don't have the date here. It was sometime in the mid 40s where a couple of brothers by the last name McDonald's opened up at first a barbecue restaurant that eventually became a hamburger place in San Bernardino, California, with the idea of feeding hungry Okies as they made their way down Route 66 towards their final destination in California. So even the founding of McDonald's has its roots in the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the millions of rural Americans that left that country towards a new life in California. And the McDonald's brothers placed that McDonald's restaurant there on Route 66, particularly to catch the business of those folks that were heading towards the coast. Got a couple more slides. And if there's not enough jobs for Americans, you know what's going to happen as far as nativism and xenophobia in this country. And this is a shocking, little known tidbit of the 1930s. Between 1929 and 1936, up to 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were repatriated back to Mexico. The idea was those jobs should be for Americans, not for folks that aren't Americans, except that's a little tricky because estimates claim that up to 60% of that 2 million, more than half, were actually born here. And they were kicked out of this country not because they were legally not citizens, but because they didn't fit the mold of what most white Americans believed that Americans should look like. This was ethnic cleansing. Not violent, but ethnic cleansing nonetheless. More than half of those 2 million people were actually born in this country and by birthright were Americans, and yet were repatriated to Mexico nonetheless. Not the first time it happens, not the last. And what about Herbert Hoover? By the way, Herbert Hoover was Calvin Coolidge's vice president who took over after Calvin Coolidge had a heart attack. Herbert Hoover himself was a very wealthy man, an engineer by profession, which is pretty rare. Made the symbolic gesture of not accepting the president's paycheck during this time of the Depression. But he was what we call today a free market fundamentalist. He had an unshakable, unpliable, unmovable belief in the free market, in the idea that any government interference would only make things worse. That the market has the ability to regulate itself, of fixing itself in the long run, and any government interference would make things worse. This was almost a religious belief among conservative free market believers. Okay? That means he did very little. Here's the problem, sir. People are suffering. You hold on to your almost religious belief that any government interference in the economy would only make matters worse. In the meantime, how much human suffering are you willing to accept until the invisible hand pops out of somewhere and starts to get the economy back on track? Understand the thought process. Eventually, whatever people do own will start to break. Eventually, people will get hungry, and somehow, some way, demand is going to come back, and then businesses will start making business, making and selling things again. But until that happens, okay, how much misery are you willing to accept? And Hoover was willing to accept it all because he had a steadfast belief in that idea. He believed the economy could repair itself and refused to let the government intervene. Despite his declining popularity, he created a couple of public works projects, but a little too late and of negligible impact on the overall economic picture. They proved insufficient, too late to save his presidency, and now you have another realignment. Herbert, and there's a lot, Herbert Hoover's blamed for a lot of things. And whether some of these things were he could control or not. But Herbert Hoover, whether justifiably or not, is ranked as one of the worst presidents in the country because of his inaction. Although it was not 100% inaction. Herbert Hoover is going to be almost single-handedly responsible for plunging the Republican Party into the wilderness. There's not going to be another Republican in the White House until Dwight Eisenhower in 1950. And the vast majority of voters who in the 1920s turned towards the Republican Party lost their faith in the Republican Party, lost their faith in pure laissez-faire market economics, and did a complete 180 shift to the Democratic Party. And the candidate that they fielded in 1932 who did believe that the government needs to intervene, and that would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which is going to happen in the next slideshow. And there's a picture of the Boulder Dam, which eventually will be called the Hoover Dam. It was a public works project. He tried to get governors, hey, start public works projects, put people to work, but wasn't enough. So that is one of the legacies that Hoover tried to create a big public works project to produce jobs to try to alleviate the situation. There would be no Las Vegas if it were not for the Boulder Dam, because the Boulder Dam provides electricity for the Las Vegas area. Some political cartoons, but we're already at 55 minutes. So what's interesting is that people lost their patience with Hoover. They were not willing to give him another term. But as far as a successor, they gave that man 4 terms because he didn't succeed in the first 4 years. But for some strange reason, people had a lot more faith and patience for FDR than they did for Hoover. Lastly, just touch upon the subject before we close the video. The March of the Bonus Army. All these guys that went to World War I, when they volunteered, okay, there was an incentive that after X number of years, the federal government's going to give you a certain amount of money as a reward for your volunteering. Well, a bunch of these guys got together and decided, we can't wait. We're going to march to Washington and demand Congress to give us that money early because we need that money now. And they went and they camped out in front of the Capitol. And they were there, I believe, for weeks. And Hoover didn't want them there. They made his administration look bad. Congress didn't want him there. Even though Eleanor Roosevelt went out and gave coffee and soup to the veterans who were there. Long story short, Hoover calls out the army to violently expel the bonus army from the the staircase of the Capitol building. And it's interesting, the guy that spearheaded that effort to basically violently expel World War I veterans from in front of the Capitol would be future General Douglas MacArthur. Okay? All right, so that's it for the 1930s. It's about an hour. If you have any questions, you know how to get in contact with me. And there will be a quiz with questions. And that's it for now. Next time we talk, it'll be the New Deal and probably the last video you see this year.